Great, let's get started. So my name is Ellis Devine and I work in marketing here at Magnolia. And I'd like to welcome you to our very first virtual meetup, Get Ahead with Headless, with our special guest, James Semple from Salesforce, who'll be joining us live from Boston. Before we get started, if you have any comments, reactions, or any questions throughout today's talks, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box below. Questions will either be answered on the fly in the chat by our panelists or addressed at the end in the live Q&A session. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Darren Hitchcock, Magnolia's General Manager for the UK, Ireland and Nordics, to warmly welcome you to this meetup. Darren, it's over to you.
Thanks, Alice. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a shame that we're not in an office or in a really nice meeting venue, but that will happen somewhere along the line. We just thought it'd be better to keep this one virtual for now. And it also allows us to have our guests that are coming in from very many different locations across the globe. Just a quick overview of the agenda in front of you. I'm going to run through why we're doing the agenda this way, but we're going to be talking very much about front-end technology. Ellis, if you can move on. So I wanted to quickly start just with the way that the market's gone, and traditional CMSs have been split really from their old category into what Gartner are calling either a DXP or a agile CMS. And Magnolia sits firmly now in the DXP category, but within that category, again, there's a further split where you're either an all-in-one solution that comes with all of the benefits of that all-in-one solution, or actually you're more of a composable approach, which is where Magnolia sit. And the point about being composable is literally that you can weave your existing architecture into a proper DXP platform, and you can use best of breed technologies. So the heart of this is all around the integration and composability. So this is the simple view of that. Alice, if you can go on to the next slide. This is really the more open view of Magnolia. And really from now on, our meetups need to be around all of the connections and all of the arrows that actually exist within this architecture slide, which helps our technical community understand how to connect, how to make the best of not just the systems they sit on, but the interoperability of it. So Ellis, if you can go on to the next one, what we're focusing on today is very much on the front end. And Topher is going to talk about Jamstack. It's more of an open methodology rather than a closed community. What we like about Jamstack is it's all the modern front-end technologies and how Magnolia would integrate in and around that ecosystem. And you can also see how PWAs have become a modern part of digital experiences. And we've got Salesforce's PWA kit as part of that front-end framework. And again, Alice, if you can just click next, what we need to do is to talk about how to bring a content management solution with all of its enterprise capability into that modern world. And one of the ways we do that is through our Headless Accelerator. So we're not just talking Headless CMS. We're not just talking about the capabilities within that. We're talking about how to accelerate that development. So all of the feds on the call, we want to keep you in a happy place rather than having to get bogged down in what does a CMS mean and look like. But Ellis, last slide from me. What we've got to do is make sure that everything we do for the techies to make it really fast and agile and interoperable, we've got to make sure that we look after the business too. And we will bring some of the capability back into our experience layer. And what's key about this is all of these technologies can all come together for the business users. They don't have to worry about all the complexity anymore. They can just work in some of their optimization capabilities inside the experience layer. And that's what Chris will sort of bring us back to. So meetups are all about the technical community. So without further ado, let me hand back to Alice so that we can crack on with some of the more technical stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you, Darren, for that introduction. Now let's jump straight into the first talk. And it's our very own Topher Zimmerman, a product manager here at Magnolia. This is best authoring experience meets best developer experience. Magnolia plus Next.js. Enjoy.
Hi, my name's Topher. I'm a product manager at Magnolia. And today I'd like to share with you how we can bring the best authoring experience together with the best development experience on Magnolia. So what I want to cover is basically let's go into best developer experience, what that means, let's talk about the best authoring experience, and then let's actually look at how we can develop an authorable Jamstack project with Next.js. So what makes the best developer experience? Well, we're talking about Headless today, and the beauty of Headless is that developers can choose their own stack. So they can create the development experience that's best for them. They can choose what frameworks they want to use. And often they're choosing front-end frameworks like um, React, Angular, or Vue. Um, so what brings them to the Jamstack then? Well, the thing is that working with those frameworks I mentioned that run in the browser are great. They're awesome frameworks, but because they're running in the browser, they have some issues. So basically, and it all relates to that there isn't kind of an actual page, actual markup sitting there that other services like website crawlers can read. So this hurts SEO rankings. This can prevent social previews. For example, on Twitter or Slack, you know that when you link to something, it shows you the headline, it shows you maybe an image or some text about that page. And these SPAs, if they have to load so much JavaScript right at the beginning to even render the page, they can have long loading times. And we know how important performance is today on the internet. And they can have security issues because it's the browser communicating with the server. So what is Jamstack? Well, originally Jamstack kind of had this acronym capitalized, and that stood for JavaScript APIs and markup. And while that's still fairly relevant, the whole methodology is in active evolution now. But still, at the core of it is some kind of pre-rendering. So this is like static site generation. So um, the entire front end is actually built ahead of time into static pages and pushed to a CDN so that when anybody accesses that page or a search engine spider, they get the page lightning fast because it's already rendered and it's already sitting at the closest edge to them on a CDN. Of course, the page starts static, but you still want dynamic pages. So then, after that first load, they load in more JavaScript and become interactive. And then the idea is to use this network of great services and APIs that are out there in order to do things like, authentication, interactivity such as purchasing, shopping carts, marketing forums, all that sort of thing. You can satisfy with services. So what are the benefits of this approach? Well, your site's going to be really performant. It's going to be secure. And basically your site can't go down because nothing is more scalable than a CDN. So your site will always be live. And it's independent from it can be completely independent even from the CMS and so forth. So your other services might have some issues or some downtime, but your statically generated site will stay live. You're going to have great SEO. Your social previews are going to work, but you can still use the front-end technologies for your whole project because these Jamstack systems are based on those nice front-end frameworks. So let's look at one way to do a Jamstack, which is Next.js. It's created by a company called Versal, and they call it the React Framework for Production for these reasons that we were just discussing. It's called a meta framework, and that's because it's a framework for a framework, in this case for React. We have other ones like Nuxt, which would be a meta framework for Vue. It is at its core, or a big thing it does is static site generation. And it's really the most popular and, in my view, most innovative. We see Next bringing things out that other frameworks then follow or adopt. Of course, there's cross-pollination in all directions, but Next.js, they're really doing a good job. What's so great about Next? Really good concepts, clear concepts, not too many of them, great documentation. This concept of file-based routing, which is kind of a back to the future kind of feature where you can have a number of files in your project and they will be based on their path and their name. when you hit that URL, you will get that page, which is kind of actually a special thing in the front-end framework world. It supports both server-side rendering, SSR, and the sort of like on-the-fly rendering on a request and static site generation. And the cool thing is you can use them freely and easily throughout your project for whichever one is most the best fit in that case. It also supports something called ISR, incremental static rendering, which is basically SSG. So it's super fast, but it periodically is going to re-render the page. So content is continually being updated on the site. It's got link-based preloading, which means that once you load a page, any links that are visible on the page, the content of those links will be preloaded. So when you click on it, it's instant because it's already loaded. And it just has a great developer experience, great error messages, good developer feedback. I've got a few other charts. I just included this one in the presentation, but here we can see from State of Frontend 2022, React is the most popular front-end framework, followed by Next.js. And the interesting thing to note from all of this is that when Headless came out, one of the main things was, well, we really want to separate the content from the presentation, right? The content is in the CMS, the presentation is done by any of these, frameworks or heads. And, we're looking to the world of mobile, we've got VR, augmented reality. We don't want to like combine everything into pages anymore. That's so old fashioned. But if we look at these frameworks and the reality of how people want to work and the importance of quote unquote pages, we see static site generation, which is basically rendering pages. We see Next.js, which has this file-based routing, which is our essentially pages. We just see that these channels that use something like a page, such as mobile and desktop, tablet, are just so important that we do want to have pages as a key primitive. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't be reusable content. It absolutely should be, and it can be. And that's what we see in this new wave. So now let's talk about the best author experience. So can you even author a Jamstack project? That's the first question. Well, in some cases, you might not have any editing, or maybe just a headless CMS is used. But then the question is, we've got the static site generation. How can an author get like a live preview of what they're doing if the site is statically generated? We'll get into that. So one thing when I'm talking about authoring editing, it's something you should need to think about is, are you just editing content or are you actually authoring full experiences? So I'd like to present to you today for the first time ever the Zimmerman three-stage editing maturity model. All right. So at stage 1 is email the developers, right? You need a change. You just get in touch with the guys and gals that know what to do, and they make the change for you. So then we've got phase 2 or stage 2, entering content in a form. It's helpful. Great. You've got a headless CMS now. So now non-developers can edit, add content, but basically from one of these content types, right? So it's more like kind of like a database, right? You have a product, you have an event, you can add a new one, you can go into it, and you basically fill out a form for what that event is. Very handy, but still quite limited and quite remote or abstract from the actual presentation that you're creating. And that's when stage 3 comes in, visual experience authoring. And this is where an author gets an intuitive experience where they really have the freedom to create what they need. They can create landing pages with anything on them that they need, or like a category homepage, more rich product info. It's not just a description. You want to show images and so forth mixed in. You want to have tweets or testimonials. You really want to build out an experience for that product. So basically this is the stage 2, right? You're just entering content in a form. Useful for some use case. But visual experience authoring is where you actually can see what you're building. You're in context, you've got control, and you can preview instantly basically what you're working on. And if you want to make an edit, it's very easy to surf through the pages of your project, find the page, and then you can edit that page. All right, so that's a great authoring experience. Authors are in control. How can we bring together Next.js and Magnolia? How can we load a Next.js server into the Magnolia page editor, for one? And second of all, how can we get previews of statically generated sites? All right, let's first look at static site, server-side rendering Next.js, and then we'll get to the static rendering. Server-side rendering is still the pattern that whenever there's a request, you dynamically generate that page. So let's jump out of the slides then and take a look. I've got a server running here. Yep. And if we look at the project over in Chrome, this is we have this demo project. I have all the different technologies with the same simple project. So it's a very simple site here. I can change language from English to German. I've got a few pages, well, 2 pages, contact. You can see the URL is de contact, or I can go to the home page, switch back to English. Okay, so that's our basic little site here. How does this get rendered? Go to Studio Code. See here, I have all the different languages. We've got SSR, and what we can see is that in this Next.js project, we've got this pages directory, and here we've got this file-based routing. So I could have something like example static, and I could add as many pages as I want here. Example static is just a really simple React component that renders example of a static route. So for example, let's go back here and just load that up. Example static. All right, it's working. Example of a static route. But so I can have all the sort of traditional pages I want, and then I have like a catch-all page that if it's not a specific route, it's going to run it and load content from Magnolia. And that's done with this kind of catch-all bracket named, that's like a convention from Next, these brackets with the dots, slug. Now it's going to load this page, and this page is going to like hit Magnolia with the requested URL. So in this case, Next.js gives us get server-side props. And here, this is like a convention. This function is going to be run automatically when somebody visits the page. And I'm going to get everything about the request in the context. And then now I'm calling just a Magnolia utility function, which is going to set like the page path and so forth. And then we're going to actually fetch the page content, right? We're using we're getting the full URL that we need to hit the delivery endpoint, and then we're doing a fetch to that URL. We get that content back and put it in the props.page. And the way the page is built is that we also get the navigation separately. So we'll make another request to get the navigation, and then this get server-side props returns all of that in this props object, and that's what the actual function is going to get. This is the actual function that renders the page. So then in the page, I mean, the nitty gritty is down here, right? It's essentially the key thing is that we're calling this editable page function from the Magnolia React libraries, but we're doing a few things like, are we ready to edit the page? We don't want to render the page until the page content is available. And if we're in editing mode, then we also need to load those template annotations. And to load those template annotations, that when we're actually in the page editor, it needs to be done in the client side, right? And that's where we can use React's use effect, which is only run in the client. And that's when we'll get the template annotations. So now the question is, we've seen we've seen this React project running, but how do we edit it within Magnolia? Well, it's really easy now. So now if we look into the Magnolia Lite module, we can look at this SSR project, look at our basic page. We've made this improvement to the React library and the page editor that it can load any URL directly. So here I have base URL. I can point it to my local React project running on localhost 3000, and I can have it pass on the path that's being edited and the language. And this means that you know in my project, if I go to the SSR minimal, I'm loading everything in. It's all editable. It's got the bars, the template annotations, um, kicked into gear. And for example, I could just, make a change. And I'm going to see that change in my live project. Yo. All right, so that's SSR. What about SSG when we're doing like a statically rendered site? Well, it's quite similar. Let's get my static site running. I'll stop this one. And I've got the same project in static. And what we do with static is we want to actually run a build. And this is interesting because it's, some of those pages can be server-side rendered, some of them might be statically rendered, and it gives me this whole report of how the different pages are going to be rendered. So, for example, here's this slug page that we also had in the other project, and it actually, you'll see how we configure which routes it actually renders. So it renders the slash, it renders the slash DE, slash contact, and slash DE contact. Those are now all static pages. And it also handles this interesting API preview. Okay, so now that it's running, now that it's built, I actually need to run the server. So now we can double check that it's running on localhost 3000. Now I'm running my SSG project. And is it editable? We also need to load the SSG project. So now, yeah, it's editable. So how's that working? Well, the interesting thing is that it can actually run in two modes. It runs in this static site generation mode or in preview mode. And that's actually a Next.js feature that we've integrated with in this demo project. So let's take a look quick how this looks in our other project, SSG project. So the site structure looks quite similar. I've got this slug page to catch all the other routes. And here, instead of get server-side props, I get static props. And this is another kind of concept of Next.js. So this function is going to run when I do the generation. But the very interesting thing is that if I look at this helper, this get static props Magnolia, got that in my Magnolia directory, utils. The context is going to have something, it's going to have a preview value set. And I'm going to check, am I in preview mode or not? And if I'm in preview mode, then I'm going to get my URL from a slug parameter. Otherwise, I'm going to get it directly from the query string. Okay. And this is happening basically, I'll show you, in Magnolia, Light Modules, SSG. Now, if we look here, instead of just, having the URL be language path, I'm actually hitting something called API preview slug. And then the path I pass in as this slug. So I'm actually hitting a different route when I'm doing the editing. And this API preview is a route in my Next.js project. So under pages, I have API, and here I have preview. So it's going to hit this page. And preview is basically just going to, on the response, set the set preview data and pass on the slug that I provided. And this is the preview mode from Next. It's going to set some cookies in the browser. So it's going to know based on those cookies whether it's just doing a regular static render or whether it's doing a dynamic render. So if I make a change, so here's my SSG minimal. If I change something now, for example, let's change the order of the image. and the paragraph. I put the paragraph on top, and I can see that preview because it's running it live because that cookie is set, whereas the static site um, is still going to reflect just what it had before because I haven't changed it at all. I would now need to do a rebuild to get that new content and have the change in my static site. All right. So in a whirlwind, that was next SSR and SSG. These projects are all online, available for you. Minimal headless spa demos on our Bitbucket account. It's right here. I encourage you to check it out. You can dig into it in a little more detail than I was able to cover in this presentation today. All right, so that's it. What I wanted to show you today, how you can bring the best authoring experience with the best developer experience together with Magnolia. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Topher, for that talk and obviously demonstrating the visual spa editor and preview, as well as showing what a best authoring and developer experience looks like. Just so you know, any links to demos or articles that are shared throughout today's talks will be sent to you along with the on-demand webinar recording at the end. So up next, we have Chris Jennings, a Senior Solutions Architect at Magnolia, who will now talk us through how Magnolia's personalization enhances headless projects. Chris, over to you.
Hello, I'm Chris Jennings, a Magnolia Solution Architect. I'm based in the London office. In keeping with today's theme about headless, I'm here to talk about personalizing headless content served out of Magnolia. I want to cover what's new in Magnolia. I want to talk about how headless personalization works, and then look at why this is an improvement, why this is better for us as developers, why this is better for Magnolia editor users. And finally, we'll take a look at how you could extend upon this work to meet more complex use cases. So, what's new in Magnolia? The what you see is what you get single page app editor was demonstrated in these meetups a couple of years ago. Scott demonstrated this at the HQ of Argos, and it was included as a standard feature in Magnolia 6.2, which was released late March 2020. You may have missed that announcement because that was quite a busy period of time, but the spa editor functionality has been available all of this time. We have spent the last couple of years working on this to improve it. So we have the ability now to manage JavaScript outside of Magnolia. You can say deploy straight into Netlify, and your front end doesn't need to be located in the same place as your Magnolia backend. We fixed some little issues with the property types that we were serving up through our REST endpoints. Everything was a string, but that's now properly typed. We've hidden the metadata from the responses as an option, so you can have smaller responses using up less bandwidth when you're serving things out, perhaps to mobiles on slow connections. We now have GraphQL support. That was requested by quite a lot of people, so that's available now when you want to serve out your content types. And there's better cause management is built in now. Previously, this was done with more generic response headers, but now there are specific filters for managing cause. And since a recent release, April this year, we now have the ability to personalize REST responses when serving page structures across Magnolia's REST endpoints. So to look at how this works, first off, we will recap on what exactly is personalization inside Magnolia. So in summary, editors build variants of content. This could be an entire page, or this could be a single component. They build these variants and then they assign them to different audiences. And when a user requests some content out of Magnolia, we examine that HTTP request and we take traits from there. These traits are then matched to those pre-chosen audiences, and if we find this user is supposed to receive this version of the content, we take care of serving that to them. Content is always served over the same URL. People don't need to know that they're going to receive a different version of the content. Magnolia makes sure that everything happens transparently. So what's new in the world of headless is the traits that we use for personalization are now better suited to headless environments. And the first one of these is the URL parameter. So we have the ability now to make Magnolia look at URL parameters and understand that they may have an effect on the content that is served, not just on things that perhaps are happening at the front end. So these could be UTM parameters. Everybody is aware of tracking using Urchin tracking module in Google Analytics. We can now tie content to perhaps a particular campaign that's running somewhere else, or the medium of that campaign, or there's a UTM term which is used when referring people from paid search. We could tie in different pieces of content to match where people are coming from. And perhaps we have perhaps an e-commerce product listing, and we could look at how people are behaving with this. So if people choose to order products by the cheapest, then perhaps we might encourage them to sign up to a newsletter in order to get a discount code. If people choose to order products by the latest releases, if we wanted to encourage them to sign up to a newsletter, then we might explain to them that the newsletter would proactively update them about the latest product releases. And of course, these can be added into your JavaScript apps if they have their own logic to understand when a user behaves in a certain way, then that makes them a certain type of user. They can then inform Magnolia through that URL parameter that they want to receive a certain version of the content. Very similar to this is we now have support out of the box for HTTP headers. So this could be the new user agent hints that are being produced in Chromium-based browsers, or they could be browser config as well about particular languages that are wanted and things like that. And again, this can be added using JavaScript apps that contain their own logic. Potentially these are more discrete than putting the user segment into the URL. Then we can hide it away as an HTTP header, and the user doesn't know that we are targeting them with different versions of the content. And finally, the third of these new traits is we have improved our handling of cookies for personalization. Now, these are a very, very simple route to integrating different parts of a front end to share information with the content management system. So if we have a login screen, we send our users over there, then we can mark something into a cookie at that point. If the CRM system believes this user is a certain type of user, or perhaps this is a user who owns a certain product, we can include that data in the cookie, and we can use the user as the transport medium to then inform Magnolia later on. These are the cookies that I have, and we can serve content to target what another system has marked them up with. This means that there's no need to track state within Magnolia. As we see third-party cookies being sort of eased out as people get more and more concerned about their online privacy, it means that we can control the entire process within one domain end to end. There's no leaking of that data into third-party systems. So let's take a look at how that works as a refresher of how do we configure personalization, and let's see the REST endpoints that come with it. So here we are inside the Magnolia page editor. What we see here is a very simple single page app that's been built using React that contains this main area inside which we have our headline component that simply has some text in the center here. So let's say for this example use case, we wanted to serve a different version of this headline to users who had come to the page via a particular campaign that we were running outside of our own website. So in order to do this, we would select the appropriate campaign, and we begin with add a component variant. Magnolia creates a copy of that component for us, and we can see here now we have this new choice between the original and our new version, which it calls variant 0. So we can use the standard Magnolia WYSIWYG tools now to change this and say hello campaign traffic. And we can save those changes, and now we can see we have our two different versions of the component with the different values inside them. So the next thing to do now is to, having set that version, is to select the audience that are going to see that version. And for this we say choose audience, and we can first of all give this a name. And now we get to choose from the traits that we were just discussing. We see a list of all the traits that are available, and we can see this one has been pre-configured for us with a UTM-ID trait. We pick that, and we say for the purposes of demonstration that our UTM-ID is going to simply be 123. And this means anybody who comes in carrying that UTM-ID as a URL parameter is going to fall into this audience, and they're going to see this version of the content. So we save the changes there, and we can still flick between the two, but also we can see this now. If we look at a full page version of this, we can see the default text that was there to start with, And we can come up here and we can say, well, what if I was to come here with a UTM ID of 123, and we would see how that changes. Now, because this is a single page app, because this is being fed by one of Magnolia's delivery endpoints, and we can see up here, here's the component that we're interested in, and here it is with the message hello meetup. And when we request that, we're going to get that same version all the time. However, if we come up here, and again we say, well, I want a JSON representation of this React minimal page, but for a user who has a UTM ID of 123, and we can see now we get a much more detailed response, but crucially, we get the text in here now has changed, and we can see the hello campaign traffic. Now, this additional metadata that's included here, this is provided so that the front end understands that it's receiving personalized content, and it can understand here why it's receiving that content. So your front end may choose to act upon this, and it understands that it has triggered something within Magnolia, but at the same time, the properties that it's going to receive, in this case, that property is simply text, is now going to be personalized to put the right content in front of the right audience. So now back at our slides. We've talked about what's new, and we've seen it all working now. So let's talk about why this is an improvement for us as developers. One of the key answers to this is light development. If you've used Magnolia previously for personalization, then you will have had to have gone through configuration of traits through the configuration tree inside the Magnolia UI. This can be quite fiddly. There's no support in here for auto-suggestion, perhaps, of the properties you're trying to set up. And it depends on you exporting this as an XML representation to then get some version control over the traits that you have set up. And for something perhaps like campaign IDs that are going to change over time, it requires you to come in and reconfigure Magnolia through its UI. So now traits are configured through light development, and here's an example of what they look like. And we can see here at the top of this example, we have the type, which is simply cookie trait. This is just to tell Magnolia there's a new cookie that you may be asked to personalize upon. And we can see above that, the name of the cookie is signed up. Beneath here, we come down here into the rule field, is where we set the different values, and we simply type them out into a YAML file. And in this case, on choosing to customize content based upon this signed up trait, the user will be given two properties, yes, they're signed up, or not yet. These relate to true or false being stored within the cookie, and it makes it very, very easy to improve upon this. If we were to track on campaign IDs, if we were to track on types of user or user behaviors, as we added more of these types, as we added more behaviors, it's very, very easy to come and change this YAML file, to simply deploy this back into Magnolia. If you're using Magnolia hosted in our PaaS systems, or in the soon-to-be publicly released Magnolia SaaS, this is simply updated through a git commit. It's very, very quick, very, very simple. Why is this better for my users? Well, we've talked about editors, and again, if you have seen Magnolia's old way of working with cookie personalization, the user was presented with the ability here to choose a cookie, and then having said, I want to personalize upon a cookie, then they were given a list of all of the cookies that were available to them and all of the different values that could fit into that. And of course, this raises the question, why should the editor need to know that they are dealing with values that are stored as cookies? Why does an editor need to understand the difference between a cookie and an HTTP header? So this has now been done away with. As we saw in the demonstration earlier, we simply list the names of all of the different things, whether it be basket value, whether it be is the user on the mailing list, and the editor interacting with this list doesn't need to know anything about exactly how these are being conveyed. They don't need to understand the HTTP system beneath all of this. They simply understand that when a user reaches Magnolia, they may have a UTM tracking ID. They may be on a mailing list, they may not be. So the final thing that I want to dig in to today is how you as Magnolia users, as Magnolia developers, might go about making this even better. And the key part to look at here is to go back to the cookie trait, and there's an optional property that usually can just be left blank, and that is the voter class. Now what's happening is Magnolia has to look at the different traits that a user exhibits to work out, does this user match any of these audiences that have been built to match against different versions of the content. So here we see the default one that's being used is called the name and value voter. And the logic inside this is very simply, does the value of the trait equal the same trait set up inside the audience? So you can take this, you can make changes to this code, you can develop your own voters, and then using light development, you can tell Magnolia to use your customized voter to decide if the user falls into this audience or not. So some examples that you may want to consider is you could build a greater than voter. And we could use this to perhaps look at the value of a user's basket. And we could say, well, if they've got more than this amount, then they fall into a certain group. So this allows you to target sections of users rather than having to look at targeting individual people based on the amount of goods that they've got. Another thing to consider perhaps is matching on viewport width. So we can understand that perhaps sometimes we want to hide different parts of a page according to the viewport that the user is using. Well, this will allow us to customize the content based on that viewport as well. Another one to consider, that potentially you could put a regex into this voter as well. And this would allow you perhaps to match multiple campaigns and consider them as one trait, or to look at user agents coming and spot, here is somebody who's on some kind of version of Chrome or some kind of version of Safari, but without having to match on equals and look at version numbers. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about with the personalization of headless content. Please do get in touch if you have any questions, if you'd like to discuss perhaps building your own voters or how to write your own configuration for this. It'd be great to hear the ideas that you have. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Chris, for bringing us up to speed with what's new from Magnolia's personalization functionality, and as well giving that demonstration of how to configure personalization and the REST endpoints. Just a reminder, anybody has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box below. All of the answers will be answered live in a live Q&A at the end. So up next, it's Vishal, a solutions architect again at Magnolia, and he will be introducing our brand new headless accelerator for 2022. This is accelerating the headless development of digital experiences.
Hi, I'm Vishal, and I'm a solutions architect here at Magnolia. My primary focus is around front-end technologies, for example, React.js, AngularJS, and Vue.js as well. What we're going to be looking at today is the headless accelerator. And what I'll do is I'll just explain to you what it is very quickly. The headless accelerator is a fast, reliable way of shipping code, and along with that, it gives us a great developer experience. If we just go over to this next slide and look at a diagram of the accelerator, we can see primarily the headless accelerator lives inside this yellow box over here. And the yellow box consists of a terminal window and an IDE. And we use the headless accelerator within the terminal window to generate code. In this instance, in this demo, we'll be generating React code, and we see how that React code is wired very closely to Magnolia. The output of that is a React application that makes calls to Magnolia, the headless Magnolia, and that's how the whole accelerator comes together. Right, so let's take a look at what we'll be covering today. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go from having no project at all to actually jump starting a project, downloading an instance of Magnolia, npm installing a React project, and then wiring up the two together. And we'll see how quick and easy that is to do. Once that's done, we're in a situation now to actually start to create components in a headless fashion. And then we'll go on to actually creating a content app. What do I mean by a content app? Well, some sort of way of inputting data into Magnolia and exposing that out as a REST API. And we'll go through and look at some other advantages of the headless accelerator. Brilliant. Let's go along and see our first task, which is to jumpstart a new project. And we use this HA jumpstart command that you can see over here. If I move over to the terminal window, this is where I can type in HA jumpstart. I'm not going to do that because it takes about 5 or 6 minutes to actually jumpstart a new project. But what I do have is one ready over here. And if we go over to the IDE, we can see what the output of that jumpstart process is. What we see over here is something that's very similar to a front-end project. We can see the folder structures, a component, we have some helpers over here, some libraries, stuff that we put inside there, and some pages as well. What we'll look at first is the components folder over here. And what we can see is some default components that come out the box with the Headless Accelerator jumpstart process. And if we go into headline, we can take a look at this feature-based folder structure. So that's one of the first advantages of Magnolia. We get a feature-based folder structure with all the files that we need to create a component. And what we can see is we have a YAML file over here. Apologies. And a YAML file is used to drive Magnolia. We call it light modules. And what we can see over here is this is a form. And the form has a title and a description. And then next to that, we have a React component over here. And as we can see, the React component correlates to the form, the YAML file, which is a Magnolia light module. And we can see we have a title and a description over here. And that correlates to the title and description within the props inside the React component. Next, we have a stories file over here. And the stories file is the configuration for Storybook. What do I mean by that? There's a command that we run to fire up all our components within Storybook, and it acts as a type of visual documentation, visual API for all of our components in React. And that's outside the box. That comes for you whenever you create a component. All the configuration is written for you. Next, we have a TypeScript file over here, as you can see. And in the TypeScript file, we can see that we have an interface over here. Now, many of you will know what TypeScript is, but just in case you don't know what TypeScript is a way of casting properties in JavaScript to strings or numbers or so on. And I can speak from personal experience. I remember when I went over to my first TypeScript project, it took a little bit of time for me to learn, but once I did learn that within a couple of weeks or so, I realized that I hadn't been looking in the developer tools and debugging low-level JavaScript problems. TypeScript eliminates these low-level bugs that we find in JavaScript front-end projects, and it's really becoming the industry standard at the moment. We're going to look at some very interesting things that the Headless Accelerator does around TypeScript in just a moment. Brilliant. So that's jump-starting a project. What I want to show you next is this folder at the top over here. And this is a .magnolia jumpstart folder. If you go into that, we can see that this over here is a standard Magnolia file structure. So if you do want to move away from the Headless Accelerator's folder structure in the way that the Headless Accelerator wants you to develop, you're always welcome to go in to this folder and develop Magnolia as you would do without the accelerator. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, let me just close these files down because I do like to keep my stuff nice and clean. And let's move on now to the next. Let's take a look at the advantages of jump-starting a project. What we saw is that when we jumpstart a project, we get a version of Magnolia, as you just saw, and any JavaScript project in the framework. In this instance, it was a React.js. And what the Headless Accelerator does for us is bind the two together very, very closely. And we can just take a look at that again. The binding of that happens over here. So as we can see, we have some components over here and the reference to those components that Magnolia understands in this key value object over here. And we also get this mapping done for us over here as well. And that's all done for us out the box with the Headless Accelerator. So that configuration between the two is done for us. And as we'll see in a second, is actually updated for us on the fly. Brilliant. So what we could say is then that the jumpstart process is very much like Create React App. And as we know, Create React App really made a huge difference in the industry. And it gets us to up and running very, very quickly with a headless JavaScript project going. Okay, brilliant. Let's take a look at the next task there. Let's make a component. And what we'll do is we'll make a trainers component over here. And I'll use this command over here to do that. And if I go into the terminal window, once again, I can type in this command over here and get a component, which is a trainers component. But the headless accelerator gives us something else. It gives us this integrated terminal environment that we can see over here. I'm just going to explain that to you first. This left-hand window box in the bottom left over here is the Magnolia output. So the Java output. To the right of it is the output coming out from Webpack, from the React project. And up at the top is an added additional layer that the headless accelerator gives to us. Now, what's the advantage of this? We don't have to have loads and loads of terminal windows open, going through each terminal window, one for Magnolia Java, one for the Webpack output, and getting confused and maybe missing some points. If we get into it, run into a problem, we can just look in one place and get all our feedback in this window over here. Brilliant. Okay, let's now generate some code. Let's generate a component. If you can see at the bottom, it gives us a key and what options we have. If I press C over here, I get this window coming up and I can type in trainers like so. Click on component, click on create, we go back to my IDE, and I'm sure we'll see a trainers component coming up. And there it is over there. Once again, the YAML the YAML file driving the dialog box, the form for the component over here, and the TypeScript definition over here. Let's take a look at something very, very interesting indeed. If we look at the TypeScript definition over here, we see a title. And that's all that this trainers component has for now. But I want to come along. I want to make a title and I want to make a subtitle. So I'll come along here and create a subtitle. Give it a title, give it a label. And if we go back to the model over here, we see that the headless accelerator watches the code and regenerates an interface with the subtitle as a string over here. And that's very powerful because it doesn't mean that we have to keep going back and updating our TypeScript interfaces. What's the reflection of that inside the component? We can see we have a title already in place for us out the box. And I want to add in a subtitle. So I come inside here and I type in subtitle like so. And what we get is type ahead over here. So our developers always know what data is coming in from Magnolia and is able to be used within the React component. There it is, their subtitle. I click on save now. And the only thing I need to do is just say to Magnolia, hey, I want this trainers component to be available, and I do that down here inside the available components. That's the only configuration I need to write in. So I type that inside there. I'm just going to copy and paste some of this stuff like so, and now I'm ready to actually input this component. So if I go over to Magnolia, just refresh to keep things clean and so on. And I come in and I create first of all, a column layout. This is just the templating layout for this project. You can, of course, do your own stuff here, but I'm just going to create a column first. And then within that column, I can add in components. And we see immediately the trainers component there. First of all, that dialog box that we saw, which is this dialog box over here, the light module driving Magnolia. We see that over here. And I type in something like trainers, and I'll type in welcome to our selection. Oops, daisy. Selection of trainers. Yep, simple as that. Save the changes, and the component is rendered immediately there, as you can see. Brilliant. Let's take a look at some of the advantages then of this this process. And we can see the folder-based feature structure. Just to summarize again, machine-generated TypeScript, fast, high-quality code, better DX experience. We get that type ahead as well. allowing our developers to know exactly what data goes into which components. The feature-based folder structure that we saw before makes it much more easier, less prone to errors, and machine-generated configuration. All of that has been wired together for you. We don't even have to look at it. Brilliant. Okay, let's go over now to making a content app. What's a content app? Well, a content app is some way of creating a form to input data into Magnolia. And then once that data is in Magnolia, we expose that out as a REST API. And then we can use that REST API in our React component to render out that data, whatever that may be. And in this instance over here, we're going to create a trainers list. And once again, I can copy this command over here. I can go in and type it in over here. But as I showed you before, if I just press C, I can create an app. I'm going to call this app a trainers list, like so. I create that, and let's see what happens. Brilliant. I go back to my IDE. I'll just go over here. We see that Magnolia has created a new folder called apps. There's my trainer list over there. There's a light module driving my my form in Magnolia, and there again is the TypeScript definition. Now, as you can see in this TypeScript definition, we have a interface over here. I think the interface is just here, as you can see, and we have some other interesting stuff over here that we'll look at in just a second. Let's just come along and define our content app first. I want it to have a name, a title, and then something very simple. So it's going to be a list of trainers. So it'll be like the name of the trainers, and then let's say the brand of the trainers. Something nice and easy like so. Okay, and what we see over here is, as you guessed, the TypeScript updates itself. As you can see, the title and the brand. Magnolia also gives us an ID and a path, just if we want to do any other data, anything else with that data that's rendered. For example, click in it and go to another, the actual details page of that piece of data. But as you can see, it's updated the TypeScript definition. And what we'll do now is we'll go over into Magnolia. I just need to, there you go, there's the initialization of the trainers list there. I need to just log in and log out, because that's how we get the list up, the content app up. And there's a content app over there. Click into it. Let's add a new item. And let's call it, I don't know, Air Maxes. Like so. So Air Max. That's the name of it. The title is Air Max and the brand is Nike. Click on save. We'll make another one now. I'll just click out of that. And this one would be All Stars. All Stars. Yep. And then it would be again All Stars, and that would be Converse, something along those lines. And maybe we can make one more. Pumps again, and then it will be like Reebok. I hope I've spelled that correctly, but something along those lines. Yeah. So we have 3 pieces of data, 3 trainers over here, and that now is automatically exposed as a REST API using the accelerator. And I want to go back to this file over here. We are now going to come along and call that data and then render it in a list. What the Headless accelerator gives us is this list all function over here, out the box. And what we can see this list all function is doing is using Axios, which is a way, if you don't know, of making API calls using JavaScript, of course. And we see that Magnolia, the Headless accelerator, has automatically put in the path for that. And also put a limit of 10 on it, and we can change that limit, of course, if we want to. So we're able now to use this function to make our API calls. Now, what's the advantage of that? We know, I'll tell you what, let's first of all take a look at how that works. I've got a piece of code over here that's already written, a little bit like Blue Peter. And I'm going to take this code and just paste it into here, and then we'll go through what's actually happening in this code. First of all, I input import the trainers list over here. And over here, you can see that I use the list all function that's been pre-written for us over here. And then I will, oops, daisy, where are we? And then I go and call that data and then put it onto some setter, some state, for example, some state, and then I just render out that list. Brilliant. So what we can see over here is that the API call is made very quickly. And from my experience working in teams, when we're in a sprint and we have to make a feature that has some API call, you normally add on a couple of points, 2 or 3 points onto that. A lot of this work has been done for us with the Headless Accelerator, and it reduces the amount of time we need to actually come along and write our calls. Let's go back to the pages over here. Click down and we can see there Nike, Air Max, Converse All-Stars, Reebok pumps is all listed for us very, very quickly, very, very easily indeed. Brilliant. Let's take a look at the advantages then of the of creating a content app in using the Headless Accelerator. Machine generated TypeScript. We saw that before. We changed the input to the content apps, and that changed in the TypeScript as well. And actually, if we go back, we can see over here the trainers list module over here, refers to this title and brand over here. And if we go to the trainers list there, it means that we have the title and brand over here using type ahead, like so. Yep. So that's what that bit there is. Brilliant. And also that machine generated API call, making those API calls really straightforward, really, really easy indeed. Brilliant. And that concludes the demonstration of the Headless Accelerator. I want to touch on one point as well. We've covered a lot of this portion over here, but the Headless Accelerator also gives us a range of components that we can use out the box, and those components use the web component standard. And that basically means that we're future-proof. And those components, as you can see over here, this avatar component, letter avatar, icon component, run natively in the browser. And that's a huge advantage in terms of future-proofing. Absolutely brilliant. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, my name is Vishal, and if you do need anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Vishal, for that very insightful intro into the Headless Accelerator along with its benefits. Now it's for our final talk of today and guest speaker. It's James Semple from Salesforce, who'll be joining us live from Boston for his talk, Amplified Content Commerce Experiences and Increased Sales. Headless without the BS. James, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ellis, and a real pleasure to be here today with such great speakers as well. So what I really want to talk to today is going to be a bit more on the business side of things. I know it's a largely technical audience, but I think the way to look at this is if you are technical, it's important to have these in your back pocket when justifying a lot of the business reasons for going headless. I'm working now at Salesforce really as a composable commerce evangelist, technical evangelist for that. So my job often is to convince people why they're going headless if it's right for them. In the past, I worked for a company called Mobify. I've been a solution architect for about 6 years, and I've been in the headless space around the same time. I was also one of the founding fathers of the Mac Alliance as well. So very much kind of aware of what's been going on in all of different kind of facets of headless for commerce, particularly over the last few years. Fantastic presentations from everyone else here. And I think this is going to kind of build on what they've been saying. So if we move on to the next slide, please. The first thing I really want to kind of talk about is why you should go headless in the first place. I think whether you're super pro headless, which I assume most people on this call are, or even if you're skeptical of headless, I think we can all kind of agree there's been maybe perhaps a bit too much hype around it. And the first thing to do is to start off and say, why should you go headless and what's the real benefits of it? Because I think, like I say, some have been overplayed. So the first thing I would probably say is the full control over the user experience layer, obviously, the ability to really build exactly what you want, particularly for things like mobile optimization, because even through lockdown when we were at home, people were still choosing to use their phones over things like their laptops. And that actual percentage of audience on using the mobile device to buy actually even grew during that time. So I think mobile is now a choice, or either that or we're so lazy we just can't get off of the couch to go and see our laptop. But that's a choice. So you have to really optimize for the mobile from an SEO point of view and from a performance point of view. That's really a no-brainer these days from a retail point of view, certainly for commerce. So the second one, which I feel is probably to me the biggest thing, certainly in the long run, is the ability to support omnichannel, or kind of actually just the extended architecture that commerce is turning into these days. I think for many people, a lot of retailers, don't forget, kind of the digital aspect of it was a bit of a kind of necessary evil. We have a website, fine, it does its thing. As COVID hit again, that suddenly grew into their only marketplace, their only storefront, and they suddenly realized how important it was to sell through that. And this is leading really to where we are now, which a digital estate is becoming the kind of next thing as they move forward, which is the idea that you have many, many different touch points. We're seeing some people, for instance, start to change the traditional point of sale in stores away to more of a kind of tablet-driven architecture, and this idea that really people are going to be able to use a lot of these kind of touch points, both online, in store, and then there's all the the other things, in car experiences, voice UI, native apps, everything like that. So this ability to support a much more sophisticated architecture is, to my mind, really the best reason to go headless right now, because I think it's going to set you up for the future. Obviously, they are flexible, and the ability to pull in different, we've been talking kind of about the touch points there, so kind of multiple different heads, but from the back end, the ability to incorporate multiple different products from different vendors in a fairly seamless manner is obviously a huge, huge benefit. I think one thing that's perhaps been oversold in this area is the ability to swap things out quickly. Yes, okay, the design of the projects are such that you should be able to do that. There should be loose coupling, but typically the ability to do that in the real world is still reasonably limited. You can't swap things out super quickly, because there's typically some design decisions that have been made along a project that are focused on the products that have been used. It's just the nature of the beast, I think, in that sense. Improved performance and scalability, I think, is definitely a big thing. I think the multi-layered approach of a headless architecture typically lends itself to higher levels of scalability and improved performance, often through the adoption of new technologies such as progressive web apps. Improved operational efficiency, again, using more modern technologies, the ability to do things such as deploy really, really quickly. This has been a big thing that we've seen in our projects, where customers who are able to deploy very, very quickly are able to change from, say, a scheduled deployment pattern, which is pretty common in retail these days. We deploy first Thursday of the month or every second Tuesday, and to move that from to more of an ad hoc kind of release schedule, with the idea that basically as soon as we have a new bug fix, a new feature, anything like that, we can release that. And again, that's a fantastic improvement from a site point of view. It's a fantastic improvement for your customer's experience point of view. And the other aspect of these abilities to deploy so quickly is that you don't have to code freeze through peak trading as well. So you're able to roll back at the same kind of speed. That's actually a huge operational efficiency right there. And it has numerous business benefits immediately. The next point I would say is kind of transparent costs, or perhaps transparent granular costs. The ability to split down and chop up how you're paying for your whole architecture and understand where you want to spend the money, where you perhaps want to save money. Again, I think this is an area where the misconception around here would be that it's cheaper. I don't think it necessarily is. Typically, that's not the right way to look at headless. It's more about getting exactly what you want, and there is a cost associated with it, not least the implementation costs. And then finally, the availability of skills. It's just simply easier to get industry standard skills than proprietary product specific skills. So I think that all of those are typical kind of benefits that we see out there in the industry. Next slide, please. So in this area, I would say, so I said I was one of the founders of the Mac Alliance. I tend to talk about what I call a Mac style architecture. And again, not in a derogatory way at all, but this is what I consider a traditional architecture of headless commerce. So that's what the traditional means in this sense. And what I'm talking about here is that kind of best in class. We're just using point solutions for everything along the way. And that can typically end up with, say, 5 to 7 product vendors to do that kind of architecture. So the first thing that we see as a challenge here is business tooling. I know it was brought up earlier on, certainly at least by Topher, which I thought was a really great point. Business tooling is super, super important here. You can't just optimize the experience for your customers at the expense of your merchandisers. I think that's very, very important to take a look at that right up front. And what we see is that when you have 5 to 7 product vendors, you often end up with a fragmented experience. And if I look at something that you might want to do as a retailer, you might want to say, I want to show this content to the top 10% of my customers while this promotion is active. These features could be in completely different systems, and they might not be easy to tie these together. So, we do see this, I think this is a kind of dirty little secret of Headless. We do see people actually go live and reduce some of the capabilities that they previously had, lose some capabilities. And I think this kind of leads me to what I would consider the biggest misconception of Headless, which is typically retailers think that just going headless, I'm going to have everything I have right now, plus a whole bunch of new features. Well, actually, you might have to trade some things off like that. And, you have to be very aware of that. So it's kind of a thing I often speak to retailers about is how do you make sure you're going to do this? Take an audit of everything you have right now and ensure you get those features, because they won't necessarily come if you don't specifically, quite explicitly look out for those new features, those features and so on. Now, one thing you might say is, well, okay, I can just build this. All of these kind of niche products have these back office APIs that I could use and build my own dashboard. Which really leads me to my next point, and I know it's probably going to make me unpopular on a very technical call here, but it's front-end code complexity. Now, I think I want to be very, very clear here. I know, I come from a tech background. I know that Headless is really fun to work in. It is. You work with all these products, you can spin things together, and you can do exciting things, you can do it quickly. But I think the way to look at this is that complexity of custom code typically leads to increased cost, increased time to market, and increased risk. And I know that last one is relevant because we have seen out in the market there are projects that simply aren't going to going the full distance. They are simply not actually being deployed. They're simply there's a long project that kind of goes on and lots of money is spent on it, and eventually the project simply just doesn't go anywhere. Okay, so that risk is important. It's a really important thing in the real world to take into account here. So what I think is very, very important to specify here is the difference between code being written because you have something you're going to distinguish yourself with. Either it's a unique functionality or just a whole new way of doing something, things that distinguish your brand, and you want to maximize that because that's the thing that's going to bring you all the returns that you want. But on the other hand, a lot of the time when you're in Headless, you're having to build things that you would have just got out of the box in a traditional full stack solution. That's kind of important. You want to minimize that, which is why obviously things like the Magnolia accelerator is doing a perfect job of exactly that. So it's minimizing that kind of whole reinvented and real aspect things, having to build stuff you would have just got by default, and maximizing your time spent on the differentiators. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that this code complexity does lead to risk. And this is, even if it's integrating multiple different products, like 5 to 7 products, this can lead to, a lot of risk like that. So it's important to take that into account. Architectural ownership in a, situation where you have 5 to 7 product vendors, you're also in a situation where none of those product vendors can actually support the overall architecture. They're incapable of doing it. That they shouldn't really be expected of them. But again, this is an area that your business people running the project, the people who are paying the money for this, might not be aware of as you go into this. And like I say, if I'm aiming this talk right now at techies who are going to do the implementation, it's important to recognize that we may know this, but they may not, and it's not something they're going to expect. Again, it's that whole misconception that they just assume they get new features and they don't lose anything they already had. This is a really, really big thing here, this lack of architectural ownership. Who is actually going to be in charge of that through Black Friday trading, for instance? Who is in charge of making sure the site doesn't go down? And then, as you move on to operations, funnily enough, I said operations as a benefit, but if you don't go in with your eyes open, you're not aware of how to do this properly, operations can become a problem. They can definitely become a challenge. And we've seen this, thankfully, not with my customers, but we've seen this happen out in the industry where people do get that. And the things that can go wrong is the code gets so complicated, it's difficult to support. It takes 6 months to train people up. You have to massively increase the size of your operations team. Deployments are really, really slow and kind of risky, all of those kind of things like that. So you really have to get that side of it right. The next point is really that it's not just a technical challenge going headless. There's also kind of operational aspect to it in the sense of process. So really what I'm saying here is that if you try and do things the way you were doing it before with a full stack solution, then you're likely to not maximize the benefits you're going to get out of Headless. And Headless is a big deal in terms of how much work it is, probably the biggest shakeup in digital commerce in the last 10 years. So it's important to recognize that part of taking advantage of that is changing your process. Again, I'm not trying to say that these are bad things so much as I feel there's an element of people going into Headless uninformed, and you have to kind of go in and have your eyes open. And this is kind of the point really, is if you go in with your eyes open, you can deal with these challenges before they become a problem. And the last point really is just the whole kind of multiple vendors thing. If you are dealing with 5 to 7 vendors, then 5:30 on a Friday, your site goes down. Who are you kind of getting on the phone at this point? Do you have to get all of them there? And this can just become an issue around things like data leakage or performance, or anything like that. You now have a lot more complexity to deal with, and that has a cost associated with it at startup time, at running time, and so on like that. So these are just things, like I say, you have to take into account and be aware of before you go in. Next slide, please. So the way that we've taken this, and I think everyone's going to, I'm just not going to sugarcoat it. Salesforce has been late to the game with Headless. I think everyone's aware of that. And I think if you look at these challenges we just spoke about, that's kind of one of the reasons. Salesforce has a certain way it likes to work with its customers, and they were kind of very against the sort of ethos that Salesforce has. So what we've got is what we call our composable and connected approach, where we believe we give you all of the benefits of Headless, composable, and I'm sorry that I've been working in this so long. I tend to use those two terms very interchangeably, which is really sloppy of me. But ultimately, we give you all of those kind of benefits of composability and Headless, but at the same time, we give you an underlying connected solution. So instead of that vendor-neutral MAC architecture, like we've just been talking about, what you're getting is more of a kind of, it is a Salesforce architecture under the hood, but you're able to incorporate all of that composability, including products such as Magnolia, obviously, to put together your kind of best-in-class experience that is underpinned still with a Salesforce platform. So I find that when people discuss, alternative approaches for Headless, it either gets into an ideological discussion, I am more headless than thee kind of thing, very purist approach, or it gets into this kind of technical minutia thing, which often is completely irrelevant to the day-to-day. And both of those things disturb me, because I feel from a business point of view, some of the very, very big challenges of Headless often haven't really been looked at or solved. So let's just start looking at those. The first one would be building a headless platform that's scalable and able to deal with things such as peak trading and being scalable, globally available, highly available, secure, and performant. All of those things like that are more difficult than when you have a full stack solution. So building up a headless platform in the first place is really quite a tricky thing to do. Secondly, building a custom storefront is expensive. Magnolia has already kind of talked about the accelerators. There's a reason for that, right? Typically in a headless build, 40% of the costs are building a custom storefront. And we've seen even some of our competitors realize this and start changing the way they're doing things. But yeah, how can we solve that as well? And then we've obviously talked about flexibility and extensibility, which is fantastic. But could we do this in such a way that we solve that vendor neutral problem? Could we do this in such a way that Salesforce can still support this through our app exchange and support our third-party product vendors, such as Magnolia particularly? So this is the approach that Salesforce is taking right now. And effectively, it's kind of a have your cake and eat it. I mentioned that there's all these misconceptions about losing things when you go to headless. Maybe we can do it in such a way that they don't really lose those points. Next slide, please. And so one thing when you go with Salesforce, and again, I don't want to do a hard sell here, but just to give a kind of clear overview of what we're looking at, one thing that you get when you go with Salesforce is no matter how you access the product, everyone's still looking at the same version of Salesforce Commerce Cloud at the back end. You're always on the latest version. It's delivered as a software as a service. So whether you want to use a kind of monolithic full stack approach where you allow it to build the web pages, the kind of templated approach on the left there with our storefront reference architecture, whether you want to use our new PWA kit and manage runtime, which I'll talk about on the next slide, or whether you want to simply build all your own front end completely yourself and just use our APIs, all of them are still accessing that very same back end of Salesforce Commerce Cloud. And in fact, some of our bigger customers actually use multiple different ways of accessing this simultaneously for various different solutions around the world. So you don't have to make a kind of either or choice. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that I was going to talk about PWA kit and manage runtime. I also mentioned earlier on that I came across from a company called Mobify. This technology came along as part of that acquisition from Salesforce, and the Mobify brand name has gone away. What we've got is now what we call a PWA kit and the manage runtime. And I mentioned earlier on that building a storefront can be expensive when you're going through a headless build. I've also mentioned this whole kind of reinventing the wheel and really spending the time on custom code where it counts, where you get value for money. So what we've done here is we've built a development kit that's going to accelerate building a progressive web app. The first thing we have here is that we believe progressive web apps and single page applications really give you the best bang for your buck in terms of customer engagement. They're mobile optimized, obviously, and they simply just, customers respond much better to it. You're typically going to drive engagement, they're going to drive SEO if they're done well, and they're going to ultimately result in more money being spent through your site. So from our point of view, we've solved the common problems that you get with PWAs, which is things like you have different URLs for different pages. The SEO problem, we use a technique called server-side rendering to ensure that we have, pre-rendered pages, not in the same static site generation idea that Topher was talking about earlier on, but we kind of generate them on a just-in-time basis. So we do solve the SEO problem, and you solve the first page load problem. So ultimately, basically, you get a vanilla starter store, and some of our SI partners are also building a lot of kind of vertically aligned and even sub-vertically aligned pre-starter stores. So we have a kind of fairly vanilla one out of the box, but like I said, working with our SIs, you can even have ones that are specific to your industry, very closely tied to your industry. So they just get you started a lot more quickly. You don't have to kind of, like I say, reinvent the wheel. Very much about accelerating time to launch. The other side of this is the hosting environment, perhaps overlooked a little bit. People tend to talk about PWA kit a lot, but the hosting environment is actually a huge part of this deal, because the managed runtime is a bespoke hosting environment that works with our PWA kit. It solves all of the server-side rendering for that. As a result, you actually end up with a Node.js and Express.js environment inside the cloud. It's using AWS, using the Lambda environments there, so you have that kind of serverless approach. And like I say, it deals with all of the scalability and everything you expect there. It even does 60-second deployments, allowing you to deploy very, very quickly and roll back at the same time. And you have an administrative tool that you can work through a console, or you can access via APIs. So it can be, pulled into a bigger console, bigger dashboard across multiple different systems, and obviously designed to work with people's CI/CD deployment pipelines. So very much an enterprise grade situation. Historically, it has 99.99% uptime, and it elastically scales. So you don't really have to worry about things such as, what am I going to do through peak trading and so on like that. So what you've got here is something that's going to solve 90% of those operational issues that I've mentioned right at the start of this talk, and allow you to, really focus on just getting a good headless site. Many people talk to us and say, we're not big enough. We don't have a big enough operations team to go headless. This really solves that problem. And next slide, please. The last thing I really want to just quickly mention is the fact that also for people who are on our existing full stack solution, we now offer the ability to split that and go headless a bit at a time, really. And this is particularly cool with Magnolia as people start to move across, perhaps using content inside Salesforce, using a third-party CMS, which is actually one of the drivers that many of our customers want to go headless for, is to more tightly integrate a kind of headless approach with a CMS. And so this ability to take, say, top of funnel, for instance, and make that headless while the rest of the site, the checkout and the account pages and the help pages, they all stay on the SFRA solution. You're actually able to kind of pull this across to move to a headless approach bit by bit here. And this is great for a lot of customers, because many people are a bit concerned about going headless, or they're concerned that, it's a lot to do. And this allows them to sort of dip the toe in the water there and try it out, and effectively to get ROI a lot more quickly. And I'd like to, I guess, finish off really with just the fact that working together, Magnolia and Salesforce are really optimizing this experience for customers. I did see a question come up, which is why use Magnolia and Salesforce as opposed to just using Salesforce. And I think the way to look at it is like this, is that Salesforce does have a slight content solution, which is, I would say we have content slots, we have Page Designer, which is kind of allowing you to do kind of a page level integration there. But the point really here with using a full industry product such as Magnolia is the fact that you're getting this really focused CMS experience, which is a lot more than simply being able to drag and drop a little bit of drag and drop a little bit of content around on a page. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. All of the other features that are behind the scenes here that Magnolia is really doing a phenomenal job on here. So approvals and content management in terms of the whole content store, the ability to reuse it across multiple different pages, and the ability to update it in a really, really fast fashion. All of these things are going to give your business users the best experience possible, and it's really going to lead to phenomenal experience in terms of the actual site being delivered to your shoppers. So yeah, we're really excited about our partnership here with Magnolia, and again, it's just going to accelerate your time to market with this headless approach. Okay, thank you, Alice. So we can go to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, James, and for your obviously practical wisdom on a headless approach, and as well, obviously that introduction into the PWA kit and Magnolia, which I think is a killer combination. Okay, so that concludes all of the talks today. So what I would like to do is I'd like to now officially open the floor to any more questions from the audience. We have had a few come in, and as a reminder, please drop your questions into the Q&A box below. And if you can comment on who the question is for, this will be super helpful for obviously directing the question to that particular speaker. So you can see the speakers up ahead. Okay, I've got one here. This one seems to be related to Topher's sections. So in the static site generation mode, how does Next.js know which pages to build?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's something I didn't manage to squeeze into the demo, but for the static site generation, Next.js has another method called, I think it's get static paths. So it has one of these built-in functions that it's going to call, and then you as the developer just need to write a function which is going to give it the list of paths of all of your routes in your page. Like in the example that I showed you, you had the //en /content /de content. So you just have a method that renders out a list of those or returns a list of those paths, and then Next goes ahead and actually builds the static page for each of the paths that you specified. And with Magnolia, that's super easy. You can just use, actually we can use that same, you can make a new custom REST endpoint, or we already have that navigation REST endpoint, and that navigation is essentially all you need to generate those static paths. So you can make a REST call to Magnolia, get the paths, and then render them out.
Brilliant, thanks, Topher. And another question here: how hard is it to host a Next.js server? And do you have any recommendations for this?
Yeah, that's a good question. People might be used to hosting Magnolia, but not sure what it means to host a Next server. And it's actually, there's a lot of support for it. If you go fully static, actually all you need is a file server with like the simplest web server. And then if you want some of those more advanced Next features, which is more likely the case, they do make it super easy. You can they have containers, Docker containers that will have everything configured for you, or Versal, the hosting company, will host Next projects. Netlify will now host Next projects. And if you're using Magnolia Pass, you can opt to have our Node.js server as a part of the Pass platform that it can also host your Next apps. And we have a number of customers already doing that.
Brilliant, thanks, Topher. This next question, it's related to personalization. So Chris, I'm going to throw this one at you. Can I combine traits together to target users who are X and are Y?
Yes. So I didn't cover this in the demonstration. It comes under personalization rather than being sort of headless specific. But yes, you can build aggregations of traits into what we call a segment. This is done in a separate app. So what you have the ability to do there from an admin viewpoint is you can move that away from your editors. So you can give them just sort of a handful of preset segments when the logic behind them is quite complicated. So it could be people who have a combination of multiple cookies, perhaps a header as well, and then something else happens to trigger them into that trait, and you can build those as an admin and hand them over to a user who then just simply chooses from a list, people in this segment, people in that segment.
Brilliant. And I think there's another question here for you, Chris. Can I change a user's traits as the journey through my site?
Yes, the traits are examined upon every request. So if you've got a single page app that does something to decide this user is behaving in a different way to what we thought, and now we're going to change their cookies, or we're going to send different headers with their requests, then yes, Magnolia will acknowledge that as soon as the request starts to change. Magnolia will acknowledge that there's no state built in that once you mark a user up, they remain in that segment.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. This next question is based on the Headless Accelerator. So Vish, I'm sending this one your way. Is the Headless Accelerator only for React front ends, or can the Headless Accelerator be used on other front end frameworks like Vue and Angular?
Yeah, absolutely. As you just said, it supports Vue, AngularJS, and React.js as well. So it's available in all three of them. And we're always looking at new technologies that are coming out and the popularity of them and the uptake of them, and adding stuff to it. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And what does magnolia.config.js do? What is it used for?
Oh, so the Magnolia config, basically, the React application and Magnolia need some way of talking with each other. And if you look at the config, the key value in it is a string that Magnolia identifies. And then that string is referenced against the actual component itself. So when the two come together, we use that Magnolia config to say, when Magnolia is rendering this component within its the SPA editor, come along, take this component, the actual JavaScript, and put it onto the screen. So mount it onto the screen. So that's what it's used for.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vish. Are there any more questions? If there are no further questions, that concludes our virtual meetup. So I hope you found that as valuable as I did and took at least one thing away from today's session, although I'm sure you took much more than that. So yeah, I think that's everything. So I'd just like to wish you an enjoyable rest of the day. Thank you very much.